Hey folks, in this video we're going to take a look at developing a program that uses pthreads to do two different tasks concurrently. So basically we're going to sit and learn the basics of the pthread library. Now we're going to do some very simple things that are a little bit arbitrary, but the point is let's just get some thread code running and see how everything works. So my very first thing I'm going to do is just try to display some text, which is about the simplest thing I can think of, right? And so for example, right, if I was doing, very, very simple C, I might start with something like this, right? I might try to display some text on the screen, right? So let me just run this, let's get some nice output. All right, we get the text, right? So we've done stuff like this before, right? Now when I write this code, I'm writing inside of main, and when it runs, right, it's just running kind of in the main process, right? So I don't use threads yet, it's just happening here. So get my output. Everything is fine, except that I forgot my new lines. Let's throw some new lines in there really quick, folks. Okay. Now what I want to do as my first step is display this from a thread rather than being in the main process, right? So normally I run this, main process is active. How do I get this to show in a thread? Gonna be a few steps to this. The first thing, which I'm going to start with, is this idea of what I'll generally call a runner function, or a function that is dedicated to being the code that goes into your thread, right? Because your thread needs to know what to do. And so what I'm going to have here is basically a separate function. And I'll start typing this and then we'll talk through it. I know it'll start to look weird here because I'm using this void star thing, but just bear with me for a second. Let's just go here. There we go. And then we'll kind of fill this in. And so if I want to do right, I could call display text from main and it would print out this information. It's not that interesting because it's not threaded, okay? So nothing big is happening yet. But I've sort of set the scene here. Now what's different about this function than other things we've written is you'll notice there's a void star, both in the parameter and in the return type. So this, like I said before, this is I typically call like a runner function. The idea is that this function has the code that I want to execute inside of a thread, right? So this is my little building block, right? I will eventually write code that spawns a thread, and that thread will get told, you need to run the code that's inside of display text. The little void star thing is basically sort of like the way that has to look. I know that sounds weird, but anytime you have a runner function, it has to have a void return type, and it has to have exactly one parameter of type void, okay? So this is our first thing. Now what I need to do is basically create a new thread, run it, and wait for it to complete. Now, the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to have to create basically a variable to even track our threads, right? Because if you think about it, right, I can't start a thread or stop a thread unless I have a way to talk about a thread, right? And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use a type called pthread_t. And I'm going to call this just, I don't know, I'm going to call this TID1, thread ID 1. The idea being is that this is going to be a variable that I use to denote a particular thread that is running, right? And it's going to be the thread that I tell it to run display text. Okay. So what do I need to do here? I think right now it won't be happy with me. Right? It won't be happy with me. You notice it says here, use undeclared identifier pthread_t. So actually, right, we need to pull in a library first, right? So pthread, right, pthreads is basically something that's not available by default. So I do need to use an include here. So I'm going to bring in, I wanted autocomplete. Give me back my autocomplete. There's my autocomplete. I have to bring that in, and basically now I have the ability to do thread stuff, okay? So first step here is I have this variable, it's a pthread TID. You can almost think of it as like the equivalent of like a file handler. Like when you open a file, it's sort of like a thread handler. It's actually a struct inside, it's not a pointer or anything like that, but basically it's a way it does in a specific thread. So given that I have a thread, or at least a way to talk about a thread, I want to actually, start that thread. So what can I do? There's another thing here that's going to be a very common function for us. It's going to be called pthread_create. So this we'll use a whole lot. Let's look through these parameters and try to figure out what's going on. There's a bunch of stuff here, and I know there's a lot of pointers, which is kind of tricky. The very first thing is basically wanting a pointer to pthread_t, right? So basically, this is it asking for a variable that it can use to store what thread you're working on, right? So I'm going to pass it the variable I just created, so that will become linked together. The second parameter over here, it says attr, that stands for attribute. I'm not going to use this for now. I'll show you guys a little bit later what that could look like, but for now I'm just going to put a null there, which means let's use the defaults. Okay, so we'll just even ignore that parameter effectively. Now over here it says start routine. This is actually where I give the thread the particular function that I want to run. So in this case, I'm going to give it display text. So display text it is. And over here it says arg. This is basically any piece of information I might want to pass to my thread. So I'm going to write the word null here because really I don't need anything, right? I already know what I'm doing. I'm going to print text, I'm going to print more text. So that's not a big deal. Okay, So this code right now would create a thread that runs this particular code. Now I don't want to do it just yet because I'm worried that I might break something. I need a few more pieces to this puzzle. Okay. So right now my thread gets created, right? So that's good. Now the thing is that similar to a main, right? Main has this return 0 going on to let the outside world know that everything's fine. A thread will have something that looks similar. It'll have a pthread exit. Pthread exit. I'm going to just give it 0. Basically, this is a way that I can safely stop a thread or designate that a thread is done with its work. That's a better way of putting it. And so I need to have that there, right? So whenever I have a bit of thread code, I'll have a pthread exit at the very end. The next thing I need to do over here is basically make sure the thread completes. Let's think for a second. If I have a program here, there's one process running. It's just doing its thing. Then it creates a thread. The thread needs to do something itself, or it needs to print text. There's a small chance that my first program could complete before the thread completes, right? But I don't want that, right? I want to make sure the thread does its work before I, as the entire process, exit out. And so to do that, I'm going to wait or join on my thread that I created. And so I'm going to type the following: thread join, right? So this is another command. You're looking at basically the 4 commands that are important for pthreads. It's not like, I mean, it is a large library, but the ones that matter to us, it's not that many. And so basically this particular method, or this particular function here that I'm using, is going to cause my main program to wait until that thread completes, meaning it does a pthread exit, so that I can be assured that it'll have printed text and more text before I go on and do other things. Okay, so in here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, we'll just do TID of 1, right? So we basically want to talk about the same thread we used before. And we're just going to put in null here. This again we'll talk about later. This is a way to get some data, or one little piece of data, out of your thread. But we don't really need that for now, so I'll just put it there. Okay, I think we should be almost good to go. Let's try running this. I'm going to guess there's going to be an issue, but let's just see. Let's see, there is an issue. What is it talking about? So it says over here, undefined reference to pthread create, undefined reference to pthread join. Basically, it's complaining because it doesn't know where those functions are defined. So we're using a separate library, right? This is a little bit new for us in C. We pulled in the header over here, but actually we need to do a little bit more because the header has some like definitions for the functions, but what it doesn't have is the actual code to run anything. And so I'm going to make a change to my project. I am going to go over here to my handy notepad over here. I have mouse pad open. You notice there's a bit of text in it. That's kind of bright, so I'll close that. What I'm going to do, and I'll start to do it and then I'll talk you guys through it, is I'm going to edit the make file. So the make file, remember, is basically the set of rules that tells CLine, right, your IDE, how to compile something. If you're in a different IDE, there will be different steps. For now, we're just going to do the version that would work in CLine. So CLine uses CMake, which is a separate tool. And so I'm going to paste this line in here. And so what this line does is it basically tells CMake that when we go to compile this project, we need to use pthread. So you notice the dash pthread in there? That's what you would type at prompt if you wanted to use pthreads with a command line compiler, right? And so this is basically saying, compiler, you're going to need to use the full pthread libraries. And so this is the part 2 of getting it to actually run. So there was a little option up there. Hope you guys saw it said like reload. I have to click that. It's sort of like refreshing. So now it's going to be, oh yeah, he wants pthread, right? So first I have to tell it, edit to the configuration file, and then the configuration file has to be read, parsed, and updated. Okay. So a couple steps there. Now, hopefully if I run it, it'll actually do a thing. And there we go. So we get text and more text. There's actually one little thing I need to fix here. I have an extra ampersand there. That actually doesn't need a pointer. The thread create needs a pointer to the first argument because it's like, oh, where do I store the, like, basically thread create creates an ID of a new thread, and then it wants to store it somewhere, which is what TID1 gets used. When we go to the thread join, it's like, well, it's already there, so I don't need a pointer to it. So I just have it by itself. So we should be good there. Let's just run the scan. Yeah, so we're good. It worked anyways, but like C is a little bit unpredictable, so we don't want to mess with it if we don't have to. Okay, so now that that's working, let's try creating an entirely new thread that does something completely different. I'm going to start by implementing a runner function for it. So let's go over here. I'm going to do, again, void star. It has to be that way. And what I think I'm going to do is write a little function that computes the sum of the first n integers. That's definitely a lot different than doing a string display. So let's try that. And we'll go again void, and we'll call this data. And maybe what we'll do is we'll make that data argument that's going to the thread actually hold that n, right? So I'm going to take a sum, right? So in the end, right, it should look like something like this, right? 0 plus 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4, right? Up until, some other point, right? Something like that. So that's what we'll do there. Let's see. I'm trying to decide if I want to complete my function first or my main first. Maybe let's do the main first. And we'll just try to do this very, very simply. So if I want to do another thread, I'm going to have a TID too. Okay, so I need another thing to keep track of. And then I need another thread create, right? So I'm going to copy this, but I'm going to change it a little bit. We'll do a couple things here. First thing is I want to point out my different variable, right? So I need a different variable, or maybe I can have an array, to know about every different thread that's out there. Now, the other thing that I'm going to do, I want to do two things here. First of all, let me show you guys a little bit about attribute. So let me go over here. Let me type the following: pthread attribute t. Attribute. So this little struct here is basically going to be, it's a variable, but it's a struct behind the scenes. This is basically a way to designate certain flags about how your thread should act. Typically, it's stuff like priority. For us, we're not going to really use it a lot, but you may sometimes see code that uses it. And the way they typically set up is something like this, where basically they're going to create a variable that has the attributes in it, use this init thing to give it the system defaults, and then you can basically just pass it to the pthread create to actually use, right? And if you want to, right, normally people would do, after this line here, they would do some customization of the attributes to set it up the way they want, okay? Okay, so that's there. And again, so in either case, I guess we're using defaults, right? So the null means to use default over here. Here you can see we're doing the init and then nothing else, so it's technically the defaults as well. So we're good there. The other thing I'll change is let me give it like an argument, right? So this is basically what my function that'll run in the thread is going to get. So let's get it maybe just to compute the first 5 numbers, right? So 0 through 4, right? So it should be like 10. Okay, so something like that. Now I'm going to add another join as well, and this one will be basically the same. So I'm going to do TID2 this time, and let's see. You know what I could actually do is I could actually, thinking about this for a second, I could actually try to get basically a return value out of a thread. So here what I have a thread is doing some work. How do I get that value out of it? I could print it. That would be one approach. But maybe another approach would be, let's just return it out of the thread, right? So I could do that as well. So maybe there's going to be something in here like, I don't know, a sum variable, right? And we're not done here. But what I can do with a sum variable is I can go to pthread exit and basically say, oh, hey, pthread exit, you're now returning the value in sum, right? So this is a way basically to get output from a threaded function. So if I do that, what I'm going to now need to do is basically make sure the join knows to look for the thread's return value and does something with it. So let's call this over here, we'll create a new variable. I'm going to call this t output. So the idea is that I need a variable where the second thread join can store the result that's returned by the compute sum function. So I'll create a variable there, and then what I'm just going to do is I'm going to give it a pointer to it. That way I have sort of that output that I can save it somewhere. Okay, it's looking pretty good. I think the last thing we need here is maybe just to display the result, right? The result that gets returned. So maybe something like this. And then we can just give it the T2 output. There we go. So that should compute the output and compute some stuff in the thread and then print out the output. Let's finish writing the code in here really quick. This should be pretty straightforward, right? So maybe something like for I equals 0, for I equals 0, I less than something, right? I'll come back to that in a second. I plus plus. And then in there, right, just going to do a sum plus equal I, just adding up the different terms. So the other thing we're going to do here is actually have this variable. I'm going to call, we're basically going to create a variable called n, right? That's like how far I want to take my sum. And what I'm going to do is actually use the data argument for it. And so I'm going to write the following: n equals integer cast of data, meaning take the data that is coming in as a parameter and treat it as an integer and store it into n. Really, it won't do anything because this is a pointer, so like a pointer is an int, but it makes the compiler happy, right? And so what I've done here is I've basically sort of relabeled the input that my thread gets, which in this case will be the 5, so that now I can use the variable n to refer to it with inside of this bit of code here, okay? So that's actually pretty nice for us. It's a way to get data into a thread, and different threads where I can have different input data. And maybe just, for completeness sake, maybe let's print out the output as well here, right? So let's call this the thread result, right? So there's the returned result, and then there's the actual result that's inside of the thread. And hopefully, right, they give us the same value. And that'll be what? That'll be sum. Okay. So there's our simple bit of code here. So hopefully the plan is we run this, and there's going to be a couple things on my screen. I'm going to see the text from the first thread, and then I'm also going to see basically text from the second thread, and also text from my main, right? And there might be different orderings, probably not, because this thing is pretty straightforward, and it will probably all happen top to bottom, but there's a potential. So let's run this and see what we get. Okay, so it looks like we got text, more text, text, more text, return result 0. I don't know if you guys can see the bug. I can see it. I know what I did. I called display text twice. So that's an issue. Let's run this again with the next thing. So I corrected it. All right, there we go. Text, more text, result 10, result 10. All right, so this, right, is our simple program. And we're doing two things, right, at the same time in different threads, right? They're not going to be alive for very long because they're doing limited things, but they are both running at the exact same time, okay? Just to reiterate real quick, the main functions we're talking about here, right, are create, join, and exit. Attribute init is sometimes a thing, but not very useful for us at least. Okay, so if you want, you can play this a little bit. You can try creating different threads. You can try doing different things in them. Technically, right, this is supposed to be an efficient program because it's using your multiple CPU cores. But again, the work is kind of straightforward, so maybe not such a big deal. Again, the goal though, it really for us, right, is just to get used to this idea of doing two things at once. And then, like I said, these different functions over here, right? So create, join, init, exit. So those are our main things. All right, that's all I got for now. I will see you guys in a future video when we maybe try to do something a little bit more complicated with pthreads.